Now, before I introduce our next activity, our next speakers, Australia has very much been fortunate to have significantly contributed to market microstructure research, certainly in the last 20 years. Australia does punch above its weight in many ways. Swimming is one example. I would have liked to have said cricket, except last week was an abysmal effort. But certainly in market microstructure, Australia punches above its weight. We can list other examples as well, maybe the rugby from last night, the other night. But we were just about to hear from Professor Glosten and Professor Kyle. And I'd like to just first of all introduce Professor Tom Smith. Professor Smith will moderate the fireside chat. Tom Smith is probably he's certainly one of Australia's most eminent scholars. He's an expert in his own right in market microstructure, and he's highly cited, among other areas, in market microstructure. So Tom Smith is from the University of Queensland, holds a PhD from Stanford University, and it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Tom Smith.
So what we're going to do is we're just going to continue a panel discussion we started this afternoon. So I'll invite Pete and Larry to come up. I think you can get comfortable. It's supposed to be a fun, and short little interlude. I've got a couple of things I'll ask them. Please, take a seat. Just to follow up what we're talking about this afternoon, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. So one of the things we talked about today was how they come up with their paper 30 years ago, and there were some interesting stories. Pete, by accident of birth, his father was a cotton trader. He worked at the exchanges for a little bit, and that's the way he came up with his ideas. So as a follow-up to that, what I'd like to know is just about getting published. So there's some very interesting stories about how Sharp couldn't really get his capital asset pricing model published. Black and Scholes had difficulties with the option pricing model. Even Akerlof had terrible trouble, probably the most trouble of all. I think he tried 6 journals with his famous Market for Lemons paper. And Lucas had terrible trouble with his non-neutrality of money paper. So these are all Nobel Prize winners, right? So I thought it might be interesting, to hear from our distinguished guests about their publication, how that went. So typically, when you've got a new idea, it's very difficult, to get it published, especially if it later gets to be regarded as highly as the idea that these two distinguished authors had. So Larry, might start with you?
Okay, sure. Actually, I have to admit that I did not travel from journal to journal. Paul Milgram and I decided where we wanted to come out, in Journal of Financial Economics, and that's where it's sent. Now, when it was in working paper form, I had presented the paper at a number of places, and there was a group, probably a small group, that thought it was a pretty nice paper. And so we were pretty confident in sending it into the journal and figured we'd get a quick turnaround and it would come right out, and that didn't happen. Now, actually, I remember a phrase that I had used in the paper with sort of the exquisite arrogance of a young theorist. I'd talked about how that it was clear that there was L2 convergence here, and the referee objected to that. I can't even remember what L2 convergence is anymore. So that, but the referee had objected, and actually Paul Milgram objected to the referee's objections. And so I remember Cliff Smith visiting at Kellogg, which is where I was at the time, and so we sort of did a good cop, bad cop kind of thing with Cliff Smith. I was the good cop, of course. I was the nice guy because I was the more junior person. And Paul said something like, yeah, so I understand that we have the obligation to write a paper that people can read, but you have the obligation to get referees who know what they're doing. So subsequently, it went to another group of referees. And actually, it didn't go much further than that. I'm sorry, there's not much of a story here, but there was one rather remarkable thing. On one of the referee reports, which I thought was particularly insightful, down at the bottom, at the very corner at the end of the referee report, were the initials HM. And I thought, who writes a referee report and then puts their initials at the end? HM, anyone know? Chaim Mendelsohn.
Oh, wow.
Some reason Chaim Mendelsohn felt moved on his referee report to sort of identify himself. So no, it wasn't that big of a problem.
Oh, no, that is a big deal that if it went through first thing, right? So that's somewhat unusual for any publication.
Yeah.
So it's insightful of the referees and editor. And you have a similar story, right? It went.
I've got a similar story, but there's a story behind the story. First, I got some good advice. I think it was from people at Princeton, not to submit my paper to finance journals. And they said that like something that's new and different, when it goes to a finance journal, it gets rejected. And I think that they might have been right, because when I was in the job market, I had a paper that was kind of a predecessor to a predecessor of my 85 paper. And people thought it was kind of interesting, kind of intriguing, but they didn't think it was finance when I gave us seminars at business schools. So they said, go to an economics journal, so I went to Econometrica. And I think I was fortunate to get referees that were on the same wavelength. One of whom was Paul Milgram.
Oh,
because he told me.
yeah, I knew that, yeah.
And so the referee reports came back after a reasonable time lag of maybe 6 months or so, and they said, we kind of like this paper, you should leave it the way it is and we'll publish it. So I was really happy with that, but I didn't know how happy I really should have been with that based on other experiences that I've had. And by the way, the paper, the harshest referees were not the referees at the journals, but they were myself and my colleagues at Princeton who had constantly given me feedback on earlier versions of the stuff that I had been doing. And in particular, like Avinash Dixit, who's not even a finance professor, gave me some really good feedback. And also the second draft of the paper, I actually wrote in Australia. I wrote at Monash University when I was on sabbatical leave at Monash University. I got really good feedback from Peter Hartley, who's kind of not a finance professor, but should have been. And what happened was effectively I rewrote the paper several times, and the refereeing process sort of took place before I ever actually submitted it to journals.
That's fantastic. So, we now know how the papers are regarded 30 years on, right? The models based on both of your work are now in their 4th generation, which is remarkable, right? Because thinking of the CAPM has really only gone to 2nd generation, the Lucas model only to a 2nd generation, and I'd say Black Scholes only really to a 2nd generation. So to have gone to a 4th generation is extremely rare, right, in our field. The question I've got is, how were the papers immediately received, right? Published in '85. I know there was from the crash onwards, there was a bit more attention, or a lot more attention. But in that period from '85, the 4 years, I guess, or the 2 years, how was that? How were the papers received?
I would say it was received about the way I took off on my plane when I flew to Australia from Dallas, Texas. And I was thinking, gee, this is a very long runway. I wonder if it's going to run out before the plane actually lifts off the ground. It was a really slow, I thought a slow process.
Yeah.
And I actually had some PhD students at Princeton that were writing papers that were kind of extensions to it, that were very early on extensions, and they had very little luck at the journals. It was actually not until the 1990s really, or late 80s, really late 80s, that things started happening.
Yeah, and it was the 87 crash that,
Yeah.
that really triggered interest in this area. It was this weird area of finance, market microstructure. Who cares what happens over a 1 second time interval? And indeed, I don't know, who cares? But then the crash came, and people said, boy, there's a lot of stuff we don't understand about the architecture of the markets, how that architecture interplays with the behavior of individuals in the market, and maybe we need some models that'll give us some guidance for thinking about that.
So let me amend what you just said in one way, which was prior to the crash of '87, there were people that thought that a crash was imminent. I remember John Phelan was chairman of the New York Stock Exchange. I attribute it to him coining the term market meltdown. But he was talking about a market meltdown before it melted down. And he was going around giving talks on how we need to be worried about this. And there were conferences that were being held on basically why a market meltdown may or may not occur. And these were being held in the earlier part of 1987 before the meltdown occurred. And I think there was actually a conference being held on the day of the crash.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That was dealing with whether a crash would actually happen or not. And part of it was whether a conference on whether portfolio insurance was stabilizing or destabilizing. That was a big topic at the time. And it was a topic of discussion at Berkeley where, I think my colleagues actually caused the '87 crash, but that we were having this discussion before it happened of whether they were going to cause an '87 crash. And some of us thought they were, and they thought they weren't. But
Right.
it was debated before it happened. But it didn't stimulate interest in the journals and get papers published.
No, it
There
didn't.
was conferences and public policy discussion.
It did not, in fact. And so you're absolutely right. The portfolio insurance was something people worried about, but I'm not sure that they had sort of models to think about what the effect of portfolio insurance might be. I mean, I think because they were stuck in the paradigm that you talked about, Pete, this morning of, well, these are all competitive markets and you can make big trades and it doesn't have any impact on the price. And so they needed some models to try and think about quantitatively what might be the effect of this.
Yeah, and that was what I thought the good outcome was. So in 1987, before the crash, the SEC actually did a study, and they were studying, I think what they didn't call it market meltdown because that would be too politically toxic. So they called it, I think, a cascade scenario or something like that. That was their way of talking about a market meltdown, and they actually put together a very long document that explained exactly what this cascade scenario would look like. And it was kind of theoretical because they didn't have a lot of data. But it looked exactly like the 1987 crash that subsequently happened. And then at the end of the document, the idea that, at least this is my reading into what was being said, is that we don't have a theory to explain whether this is going to happen or not, but we've talked to a lot of really smart people on Wall Street, not John Phelan, but all the other people, and they said it's not going to happen. So we don't think this is going to happen. But they didn't have any real logic for why it would or would not happen. And so I think when it did happen, it really did reveal the need for filling in some understanding of what had happened when it happened in '87.
So this afternoon, we don't want to cover the same ground. This afternoon, we talked quite a bit about high-frequency trading, but we didn't mention low-frequency trading. Any views on that? Well, I'll hand over to you, Pete.
Okay, let's look at this case that the CFTC and the Justice Department have launched against the fellow in London, Sorrell, who from his living room was placing orders for thousands of contracts. And according to the expert that the CFTC or the Justice Department has working for them, who's Terry Hendershot, his trades may have moved the market by a fraction of a tick, okay? Maybe 1 basis point or 2 basis points, something like that. Well, the market fell 500 basis points. So where does the other 498 or 499 basis points come from that didn't come from Sorrell, who is a kind of like a high-frequency trader, kind of competing with the high-frequency traders? And I think that's approximately what we should be talking about. We should be talking about the high-frequency traders letting markets vibrate within maybe 1 basis point or so of where the price would be as a result of trading by low-frequency traders. So 99% plus of the volatility in the market is going to be the result of low-frequency traders. Putting it more in perspective, the high-frequency traders in the middle of the flash crash, I don't think they did business any differently from other days, but they would take positions that were maybe long or short, 150 million, 200 million, all of them added together, dollars worth of stock. That's not very much in the grand scheme of things trading in the stock market. The order that I think, and I agree with the CFTC SEC report that triggered the crash, the flash crash in 2010, that was for $4 billion. And that was an order from an institutional asset manager. Maybe whether it was a long-term or short-term order, it kind of doesn't matter for this purpose, but it's these gigantic trades relative to what the high-frequency traders do that set the overall level of prices, and it's the balance or imbalance of supply and demand from the very long-term traders that determine whether the volatility of a stock is 2% a day or 3% a day or maybe only 1% a day. And the high-frequency traders might turn the 2% to 1.99 or 2.01, but they're not going to have that large an effect on stock market volatility because they don't hold large positions and they don't hold them for very long.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Maybe take off your hats as market microstructure researchers. We have a number of young emerging researchers in the audience. Some advice from your long experience to them.
All right, you understand it's worth what you're paying for it.
Which is $225.
God, I don't know. I mean, I should relate something. Interest was sparked. Interest in my paper and Pete's paper was sparked by the crash of '87, and that's October 19th. And it just so happened that the personnel committee at Kellogg was making a particular tenure decision. At around November, I think it was middle of November of that time. It wasn't time for the crash of '87 to filter from the headlines to the personnel committee at Kellogg, and so they decided I was not going to get tenure. I should say, at which point I said, that's fine, and I went home to my wife and I said, what's the short list of places you'd move to? She said, New York. She's an artist. So what's the advice there? I mean, look I ended up at Columbia. I am supremely happy there. That worked out just great. And it's all kind of luck. Well, I was not hired with tenure by Columbia. Again, with the arrogance of a young theorist, I said, you'll give me tenure. I don't have to come with tenure. And that worked out fine. You know, writing papers is hard. Writing good papers is hard. And in fact, you never really know when you finish a paper whether a paper's really good or not. You don't know what the reception of that paper is going to be. You don't know what's going to happen in the world that may or may not, that may make your paper either very relevant or irrelevant. There's no point in strategizing on that, I don't think. Pete?
So I've got maybe a little different perspective, although one thing we share in common is we were looking for a job around the time of the 1987 crash, although mine was right before the crash. But I think that things have changed since I was an assistant professor. So I didn't get tenure at Princeton, and I had to go find another job. So I went to Berkeley, and I went to Berkeley without tenure. But the people at Princeton appreciated what I was doing, and they took my case very seriously, and they considered it very seriously. And I think it was, close enough to be interesting, despite the fact that I only had a couple of publications. Maybe like 2, what they would call top journal articles, maybe just 1. But they nevertheless took it seriously. I don't think any school would take it seriously now, with that thin a vita. And when I did get tenure at Berkeley, I didn't have that many publications either. So I think that there's been a movement in universities, even top schools, away from looking at the quality of publications and instead looking at the quantity. And so if you want to give advice to students, which I do give, and I've given this advice to many students, I tell them, first of all, you can't write a lot of good theory papers and get them published in top journals in 6 years. It just isn't going to, it isn't, it's very difficult to do. So if you want to do theory, especially asset pricing theory, you've got to plan on not getting tenure wherever you start and going somewhere else and hopefully getting tenure the second time around. And that's just the expectation that you should carry around. If you are nevertheless convinced that you want to get tenure at the place that you first get a job, it's much better to do empirical work because you can, if you write one good empirical paper, the second good empirical paper that follows on that is easier to write and takes less time because you've set up an infrastructure that is repeatable. If you write one good theory paper, typically you've used up all of the infrastructure and put it into that paper, and the next one is plowing a field that's even less fertile than the one you just plowed. And so it's even harder to write the second paper. And that compounds the difficulties, considering that it was hard to write the first paper to begin with. Yeah. So, I tell students this, and I also tell students that theoretical papers, I think, have a much larger standard deviation associated with their impact. So, Larry and I, in some sense, got lucky. But with empirical papers, it's easier to build what somebody would call a solid body of knowledge that you can justify a tenure case on. With theory, it's much harder. It's easy to do that in some cases, but typically it's much harder to do.
Yeah,
so,
and it seems like lots of junior faculty are recognizing this. I mean, most theory papers now have at least some numbers in them. And that's the way you have to sell them. There has to be an empirical component, I think.
Okay, well, that's great advice. I'm going to throw it open to the audience now. Mike.
I'm going to ask you the typical question, but given that regulators have said this continuously for years and years now, that their mandate is to ensure that markets are fair and efficient, they say that all the time. It's actually part of IOSCO's mandate. What, if any, did that take part in your views in terms of what you did to try and understand the sort of the operation, to operationalise fair and efficient?
I can tell you what I think about it. To me, a fair market is a level playing field. It doesn't mean that you have to handicap the smart guys so that the dumb guys can compete with them equally. It instead means a level playing field so that if you actually have better information or you're a better trader than someone else, you should prosper. And if you're a bad trader and you have bad information, then you should not prosper. And that will, to me, be fair. Now, efficiency. And by the way, what that implies is that market makers should not have special privileges that enable them to make money at other traders' expense just because they have either faster or more specialized access or because they've changed the rules so that, or structured the rules so that they have certain built-in advantages. So anyway, that's what I think is fair. And efficiency is a really interesting concept because finance professors tend to think of efficiency as in the way of what I call the FAMA definition, which is not being able to forecast prices, which is, to me, market is efficient according to that definition if it's kind of hard to make money based on public information. But that's not the right concept of efficiency to apply to the question you just asked, which is a really, really interesting and really, really important question, right? So the right concept of efficiency to apply is one concerning whether do the resources that go into trading actually generate economic outcomes that make the economy allocate resources more efficiently. And so to me, a key concept there is whether the information, whether there's a lot of information reflected in the price of, let's say, a company's stock or a foreign exchange or a bond, compared to a situation where there's just not that much information reflected. And that's a different concept of efficiency from what Fama talked about, and one that is an important part of the research that I've been working on. And so the interesting question is, like, if you have a lot more trading and a lot more resources thrown into studying one stock rather than another, does the price that comes out of that stock reflect more accurately the sort of fundamental economic forces behind its value? And if so, it would tend to send a signal to the company concerning whether they should invest more or less in their industry, and that would ultimately make the economy more efficient. Let me say one other concept of efficiency just has to do with transactions costs. You might call it transactional efficiency. If transactions costs are very low, because there are a lot of people trading, there's maybe an economy of scale that makes transactions costs low, or because the market is organized in a what I would call a fair market manner, but also just organized with good technology. That'll make transactions costs lower, and it's a very politically toxic question, but some people think low transactions costs are just fundamentally bad. It tends to be people on the left. Other people think low transactions costs are fundamentally good. It tends to be people on the right. But I tend to think that low transactions costs promote more trading, and that promotes a more accurate stock price, and that therefore promotes efficiency.
I wanted to add one comment on the fairness issue. It's interesting to look at some of the markets that have not survived. I'm thinking of the Vancouver market in Canada, basically went under around 2000 or so. It's an example of a number of markets which were sparsely regulated. Securities regulation in Canada is on the provincial level rather than on the federal level. And British Columbia had decided that they didn't consider insider trading a serious violation. And so it was generally considered that insider trading was rather rampant in the Vancouver market. And so there were lots of comments about how Vancouver was unfair and how people stayed away from the Vancouver market until eventually it collapsed. But I think the way that, I'll only speak for me, the way I thought about the effect of potential insider trading is an increase in the amount of asymmetric information, a consequent widening of bid-ask spreads, a high transaction costs. And so in some ways, I think our work is a way to quantify this notion of fair or unfair. Unfair means high transaction costs due to trading on private information which has no other public benefit. Insider trading, insider trading doesn't lead to better resource allocation, except in a rather contrived example. Trading on the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey 2 seconds before it's coming out doesn't help with resource allocation. Yet those are perhaps examples of trading on private information that in the kind of analysis that Pete and I have done sort of leads to increased transaction costs. It's perhaps our work could be thought of again as some sort of quantification of this fairness or lack thereof.
Does that mean that transactions cost, the estimation of, is just a kind of an estimation of fairness? In other words, you make the market more efficient, it becomes fairer.
No.
Yeah, so I have a paper with Vish Vishwanathan on this. It's called How Did it's just a little AER papers and proceedings paper. So it's just kind of an opinion piece, really, by research standards. But the gist of the paper is that there there are two ways in which financial markets can make the economy more efficient. One is by reducing transactions costs so people can exchange risks more readily. And the other is by making prices more informative so that when the prices are used as signals, resources get allocated more efficiently. And we think that if there's some behavior that makes things both more liquid and improves the resource allocation by having more efficient signals, that's pretty good. And if there's something that makes things worse,
Is that saying that basically if you reduce transaction costs and increase price discovery, then you'll actually you'll increase fairness?
Basically. Fairness to me, it means equal access, and I think that the equal access will tend to reduce the transactions costs and lead to that. But
That's strange, though, in
yeah.
the sense that basically the regulators say fairness on the one hand and efficiency on the other, right? Whereas you're saying, most academics would say efficiency is comprised of two elements, right? Which is what you've just described.
Yeah, I already said, I already reject that. I already reject this trade-off between fairness and efficiency because I think if you're really are the smartest person in the room and there's equal access and you dominate the market by essentially putting a lot of people out of business because your trading is just smarter, that to me is fair. So a lot of people would say that's unfair, that you need to handicap the good guy, the smart guy. So I wouldn't say that's fair, but let me go back to the way we think about it, which is price discovery, discovering a very accurate price, and transactions cost being low. What's wrong with insider trading is it increases adverse selection. And that makes the transactions costs higher, due to stuff that's in Larry's and my papers. But on the other hand, it doesn't make the price really more accurate, except for that 2-second period between the time that the announcement is about to be, the insider trades occur and the announcement is made.
So estimating insider trading, market manipulation, and front running, which are the three key prohibited trading phases in the marketplace, are something that we should be doing as part of understanding fairness. And then obviously the other two are something we should be doing as understanding efficiency, and we should be looking at the trade-off between the two. Is that right?
Approximately, I would agree with that. Yeah. Larry, what do you think? Yeah.
Okay, I think, one more question, and then I think we might have to wrap this up.
You mentioned already that one of the probably advice for the junior people, like PhD students and early career researchers, is to really think carefully what they do and how they do, but probably much more emphasis on the empirical part, in empirical research, particularly market microstructure, because we have the data, we have much more new development. But on the other hand, quite often that's like a saying going on that, you better don't do any little model, a toy model, because it's so dangerous. You'll be knocked down immediately, you'll be rejected. So what is your response to that? To have some empirics, but also to bring out a theoretical part. Do we need to be careful with that?
Well, I gave my advice to my co-author, Anna Obajayeva, and she took it. She didn't take it. She decided to go for doing longer-term research that was putting much more theory into the research. And the result is her tenure clock at the University of Maryland has run out. So now she's in her second job back in her home country in Moscow, where she, I think, is being very, very productive. But there's some people that you can tell them, here's the trade-off. You can either go for something relatively safe that might let you stay in the same university for your entire career, or you can take a lot of risks that probably means that you're going to have to move. And some people will go for safety, and other people will take risks. And she's one of the ones that takes a lot of risk.
And I'd like to add, there is no
Which I
big
admire.
deal.
Yeah.
There's no big deal with not getting tenure.
Yeah,
You just move on.
right.
There are other schools out there.
Yeah.
I was not, well, maybe I was damaged. I don't know, but I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think I was either. I kind of knew that when I went to Princeton, I probably wasn't going to get tenure.
No one got tenure then.
Yeah,
at
well,
Princeton.
some people got tenure, but the fact is they all of them wound up at Berkeley anyway. No, most of them, even the ones that got tenure, went to Berkeley. So.
Well, why don't you join with me in thanking Pete and Larry? Thank you.
Okay, just before we close up, we have a couple of memorabilia to hand out. I'd first of all like to ask Dr. Maurice Newman to come up. I really appreciate his insights. Certainly there's been a lot of discussion, debate about the rise of China. Certainly that seems inevitable. Very interesting insights about when East meets West. And I think certainly from, given that history is part of a theme that we have in this program, Maurice's expertise and perspectives over a long and eminent career are very much appreciated. And thank you so much, Tom. We're looking forward to tomorrow. You guys hopefully aren't too tired yet. We do have something uniquely Australian. We've got exactly the same, so there'll be no arguments. But it's my pleasure to provide something that's very Australiana. Please come up. Yep.
Wow, thank you. Thank you.
Larry, it's an Aboriginal artwork. So, thank you so much. Very good. Thank you. Great. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. So that formally concludes tonight. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsors, UBS, ASX, Capital Markets CRC, University of Sydney, and also the State Government, New South Wales, and the Federal Government. We look forward to continuing our agenda tomorrow. 8 o'clock is registration for those who are attending, if they've registered, at UBS's offices at Chifley Tower. And please travel safely, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks.